People in from the waiting room. I'll go ahead and give a brief spiel, make sure everybody can hear me before we get started. All right. For those of you who don't know me, I am a fellow ADE member, fellow doc editor. I'm on the New York Events Committee, so this is a co-New York LA ADE events in the virtual space sort of event. My name is Claire Avelaloma. It's very long. If you want to know how to spell it, it's in the bottom of my video, but don't worry about it. Nobody gets it right. I will start by saying thanks for coming to the conversation on mental health in the doc industry. First and foremost, you know, while people are sort of coming in, I just want to go ahead and ground this conversation by saying that we know that there's a lot going on in the world that's demanding and deserves our time and attention, and that there is a lot of pain in the world right now. Specifically, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and lift up the work of people who are fighting in the name of revolution. America and much of the world is in mourning for Breonna Taylor, Tony McCabe, George Floyd, and countless others. What we have seen, and what I hope we continue to see, is more and more people awaken to the urgent need to actively engage in anti-racism work. The culmination of this revolution and the pandemic, on top of the quote-unquote typical uncertain ways that documentary films get made, it's a very challenging time for us in unprecedented ways, certainly. So we know that you've made a choice to be here today. We know that this conversation may have an impact on your spirit and body, especially if you're Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. We encourage you to continue making choices throughout the day to take care of yourself. So thank you for taking this time, because we truly believe that loving ourselves and taking care of ourselves is definitely a revolutionary act in and of itself. I hope that we can face these difficult times together and continue to do so collectively. I think that's in part what ADE was created for. Not that any of us were thinking about the pandemic or the other crises that we're facing when it was created, but just to be able to build and have a community of support from other editors, to listen to one another, hear what each other are going through or needs, and really lift each other up. We'd like to continue to create safe spaces like this, both formally and informally, and hope to continue to do that. So before we bring on the wonderful guest of honor, who is incredibly intelligent and well-versed on the topic of mental health, I do want to mention up top that we have a Q&A. Each of you here today is an expert on your own experience. So we want to invite you to, once we go through this moderated conversation, if there are any questions that come up during the conversation or afterwards, to go ahead and submit those questions through the chat function. That is going to be only seen by the hosts as an effort to create a safe space and keep people anonymous. So the host will receive those questions. Rebecca and I will do the Q&A, and those questions that you submit will be shared anonymously. So that said, if you do feel like you would love to share your question yourself, we can unmute you and you can ask on your own. Just let us know that that's what you want to do when you submit the question, so that Megan, who is spearheading our tech side of things, is able to unmute you at the appropriate time for you to ask those questions. All right, so I think we're getting ready to start here. Thanks for listen to the spiel. I want to go ahead and bring on Rebecca Day. She is a qualified psychotherapist and a freelance documentary producer. She founded her company Film in Mind in 2018 to address mental health in the film industry, and has spoken at festivals such as IDFA, Getting Real Documentary Conference, and Sheffield Doc Fest on the issue. So thank you for being here today, everybody. This is Rebecca.
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a
Oh,
pleasure to be here.
it's going to be an exciting and insightful conversation. I would love for you to go ahead, Rebecca, and just share a bit about who you are and what Film in Mind is.
Sure. Thanks for the intro, Claire. I think you touched on really important points there, and yeah, I don't feel the need to say anything else. I just hope everyone's feeling that it's as safe as a place as possible. But of course, like Claire said, just take what you need during the conversation. Um, and if you need anything at all from us, then just ask. But yeah, so I've been running Film in Mind for, God, it doesn't feel like very long, but it's probably almost a couple of years now. I started off as a documentary producer when I was living in Scotland 12 years ago, 15 years ago, working with the Scottish Documentary Institute. And I was just, working my way up through that, going on that trajectory to being a producer, and then I kind of finally got there and sort of started saying, I'm not sure that I can do this full time, and I couldn't. It was a culmination of my producing experiences, seeing things that my colleagues were going through, the subject matters that I was working with, that just had me asking a lot of questions. I think about the way the industry was structured and the conversations that we weren't having, and just a recognition that for my personality, there were a lot of things about the industry that didn't really work for me. That, they felt like a compromise in terms of what I felt was a safe and comfortable way for me to be working as a professional. So I kind of started looking around for what I needed to do to fill that, and it was really prompted by leaving the Scottish Documentary Institute to move to the Lake District, uh, for a relationship. So I left Scotland and moved down here. It's not far. It's only a couple of hours into England, and yeah, and I went freelance, and it was this, very clear realization that I couldn't make a living as a freelance producer.
And so,
Just
what
doing
shifted? Where did you move into therapy? Because I guess to anybody else, it would seem like two different worlds.
Yeah, it
Um,
didn't for me. It was a project that I'd worked on in 2013. It's a good question though, Claire, because it does seem like two different worlds. But I'd worked on this project in 2013 called I Am Breathing, which was about a young man with, you call it ALS in the US. We call it motor neuron disease in the UK. And he'd died young, from 34, from ALS, and I was the impact coordinator on that project. So I was, I was dealing with the community. I was the point person for the community of people who were caring for people living with the condition, or people who were dying from it. And it really had a profound effect on me. And I think there were two things that happened. One was that I realized that I had an absolute lack of training to be having those conversations. Another thing was that I realized that how much I got from it, how much that connection meant to me. And when the project was over, I was quite bereft. I felt like something really big was missing from my work, in terms of connecting with people, I think. Because as producers, and maybe editors feel this too, I don't know, but you're stuck behind a screen all the time. So you're looking at that connection all the time, but not necessarily, speaking directly with the contributors. So I think it was a culmination of many things, but
sure.
that was a big influence on me. And then but one of the things was really practical as well. I was just like, I need to have something else in my life that actually can help pay the bills, because producing isn't going to do that. And I thought the two could run side by side. And then I started my training and was like, oh, I'm learning all this stuff as a therapist that I think we should be talking about and doing as documentary makers.
Yeah, so I think that we are definitely going to touch on some of the big picture industry stuff. I want to come back around to the relationships thing, because even though I do feel like producers and directors are in the field and have their own personal relationships with the subjects, I do find that the ways that we need to tell these stories is for editors to fully immerse themselves in those stories and the characters. And so that's sort of like a vicarious relationship through the footage. So I do think some of the things that you're talking about, the ways that the industry functions, the sort of uncertainty and anxiety about how things get made, lack of resources, that sort of the way docs function in some ways we would think prepares us for the unexpected, that we're not averse to watching footage as an editor, where we have all these conversations with directors and producers about what exactly the story is, and then we're watching the footage and some new story comes out of the woodworks and unfolds or reveals itself in the footage that wasn't even, maybe the initial capture. And that happens in the field too, where you go in with looking for one story and find something totally different. So full of surprises, certainly. So I would love to talk about the current moment, and then go to the big picture stuff. So to speak first about the sort of collective loss and anxieties being experienced right now, the idea that I've heard you speak to before about it being difficult to be creative amid crisis. So I wonder if you could share a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to presume how people are feeling, but a lot of what I've been hearing from people during other panel discussions and from the clients that I'm working with is there's been this almost like a freezing of ourselves. It's like, oh, I can't function, I can't look at my projects, I can't, sometimes I'm struggling to start the day, and I think, yeah, of course you are. Think what is happening for all of us, and that is so profound and it's so big. And there's a fear like you were saying, there's a fear of the unknown. Like we don't, it's this invisible thing that's surrounding us all and affecting us all. And for some people it's the threat of what might happen rather than the actual thing that's happening. That's just, we don't really know how to deal with that. And so on a physical level, our bodies are in a sort of like prolonged state of fear. And when you're in, normally fear is quite short, it's like something happens to us that makes us afraid and we release all this adrenaline, and I won't go into the biology of it, but your body reacts in a really physical way, and then you're supposed to come down from that and come back to normal. But this is really prolonged, so I think it's, in some cases, it's making us detach, and the reason for doing that is to protect yourselves. So it's like hunker down and nurture, and so the brain doesn't have space to be creative when it's doing that, because it's in survival mode. That's the strongest part of our brains. It's the oldest part of the brains, the sort of ancient survival part, and it's fully functioning. And I think it takes over everything else. So when you're having days where you just can't find a thread, then that's probably why. It could be why, and you just, I think, need to be kind to yourself.
And I think that that's probably also the idea that we need to give ourselves that space, that breathing room, and acknowledge that that's something that we're going through, that we can't just persevere as if nothing is happening. Because I do think that we're all driven by this hustle to get the project done and do what's best for the project, and sometimes that's putting yourself on the back burner. And I think that gets even more blurry in the middle of crises like this. Just even physically, if we're working from home, and the space that we would normally decompress in and try to remove ourselves from the workday and the project is now the office. And maybe if you're living in a small New York apartment like me, your office is also your living room and your kitchen. And so that space, just that feeling of in movement, or like inability to maybe distance as easily, even physically, I think has been challenging. And what I've heard is causing some decreased productivity, and just general distraction, that we can't turn on and off work as easily. in this space.
Yeah.
And so I've even seen myself try to make up time by working, that I'm distracted throughout the day, and I'll try to work off hours to make up some of the hours that I lost by being distracted or by taking time for myself. And, I wonder, it seems like something that we need to be doing is saying that it's okay to take those breaks in the middle of the day, that it's okay to step away.
In fact, it's really good for you to step away. And I'd say that, I would vouch for that regardless, regardless of whether you're working from home or we're in the middle of a pandemic. I think it's, and I'm really bad for it myself, but it is absolutely, it's the best thing for us. I think our productivity, I found my productivity is, I think it feels like it's pretty high because I actually have quite limited time, as with a young child. So I have to cram everything into these quite short hours, especially because we can't put her into nursery at the moment. So we're both working part time, and we have to cram everything in to the time that we have. And actually, productivity is so high. So when you don't have those boundaries in place, it can stretch out and stretch out and stretch out. And what you find you're doing is then your mind is switched on to work. I don't know how many hours a day, what we're saying, 50?
All the time.
All your waking time, all of your waking time, and probably affecting your sleeping time as well. And when you're dealing, especially when you're dealing with really difficult footage as well, and you can't take that space, do you feel the energy change in a room when you've watched something really hard?
Certainly.
So, yeah, so when you then step away from the edit, but you can't leave that space, the energy's still there and it's sitting with you. Mm-hmm. And so how do you then find, a room, or I don't know if you can go out for a walk or just do something that kind of like removes you from that feeling, from that moment.
So it's almost like to break it down into doses, something that's more digestible or like more sustainable, to create a pattern where we make a point to step away from the desk, traumatic footage or not, anytime, any project, but
to draw lines between what belongs to the project and what belongs to you in the day.
Yeah, and I imagine that can be, we'll go ahead and talk. I wanted to talk about this potential of secondhand trauma in difficult footage. The idea that we fully immerse ourselves into these lives and emotions of the characters, and often are tackling difficult subjects or very dark subjects, and empathizing can really impact, at least my mood personally, the sort of repetitive exposure to watching the footage. We rewatch it, recut it, and like we're sort of in that space, and that's even more complicated when something in the film overlaps with personal experience. I guess I just wanted to say or ask the potential of vicarious trauma, like what sort of mechanisms is stepping away from the desk the best thing that we can do to sort of separate ourselves from that? Is there anything else that we could, when we're in a space like that, can be doing to sort of protect ourselves?
I think the problem with that being the only solution, if that's the only solution we offer ourselves, is that we don't always notice that we're experiencing vicarious trauma when it's happening. In fact, probably very rarely would we notice. And the thing, it really occurred to me when I was going through my therapy training. So as a trainee therapist who wasn't yet qualified, one of the first things I was being taught to do was how to practice safely as a therapist. So self-care, time for reflection, the support networks that I needed to put around myself to make sure that I didn't suffer from vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, all of those things. And actually one of the most important things was the acknowledgement that I might, and I probably would, suffer from vicarious trauma. So what the therapy world does is it recognizes that we're dealing with all of this really difficult stuff, and it puts measures in place to make sure that we are able to process it. And I felt, and I was, and I was starting to look into this as a therapist. I was like, oh my goodness, this is what anybody working a documentary, whether you're a producer, a director, an editor, it needs to be standard practice. That there has to be a recognition that what we do is really challenging, like really emotionally challenging. And it doesn't mean that we should step away from it. It doesn't mean that we should stop doing it, but it means that we need to be able to admit that it's hard. And I think there's this sort of thing in the industry that it's very noble work, which it is very noble work, but you have to be strong and you have to be seen to be coping with it all of the time. Whereas actually, I think if we were to recognize it in the right way, we would cope with it a lot better, because it would be seen as a strength to have support mechanisms in place.
And so almost to the need to normalize the conversation, that that there is an awareness that emotional support and mental health, these are conversations that we should be having from the beginning of a project, or from the get-go, that it's not an afterthought.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it should be in it should be in all our training. It should be in our courses. There should be short courses on it, and we should be coming up with systems that, that we're using as professionals. So it just becomes part of our daily work. So, I mean, one of the things that I keep coming back to, and I know I haven't said to this group of people, I feel like I say it all the time, but I work with a supervisor, and you have to, as a therapist, you have to have a supervisor. It's kind of, you wouldn't be seen to be practicing ethically if you didn't have one. So they put it in an ethical framework, like, this is what you need to practice ethically, and supervision is one of those things. So every 3 weeks I have an hour with my supervisor, and he's amazing. He's not in the film world at all. He's another psychotherapist, and he just lets me work through my process. And it's a place I could go to with ethical dilemmas, with certain clients, with my own challenges, and it just helps me sort stuff out in my head, so that I can then go back and have, figure out solutions, or have worked through some of the stuff that's been really emotionally challenging for me. And I always come away feeling lifted from those sessions.
Yeah, I think that being able to have a third party to speak to, be it a therapist or a close friend, is definitely very important. And that sort of brings me to wanting to address the disparity in access to therapy services. That sometimes it's a barrier of cost, or finding somebody, or like finding the right match. And so in this space where someone might not have the means or the ability to connect with somebody who could act as that supervisor for them, what sort of space can we be is it peer-to-peer support? Is there something else outside of that counselor space?
I think peer-to-peer support would really help, but it depends how deep you want to go, because if there's some really difficult stuff, especially if you're talking about trauma, if there's really difficult stuff to process, then whoever is leading that or guiding that needs to know how to keep it safe, because even if it's secondhand trauma or vicarious trauma, you can still be triggered into that traumatic state, and that can potentially be quite dangerous if it's not managed properly. So yeah, I think peer-to-peer support. I also do peer supervision with colleagues, and that's when we're not trained supervisors, but it's exactly that. We talk through work issues and client issues and just personal stuff as well, and it's really useful. So yeah, there's absolutely space for it, but I would like to see the film industry paying for this more. I want to see it in the budget
from the beginning, like a line item in the budget that, given a certain subject matter or type of work,
absolutely, and and it might not be necessary for all for all it isn't necessary for all documentaries, we know that, but there are some where it really is necessary. And if we were sitting down and doing mental health risk assessments at the beginning of each project, we should be asking those questions. It's like, how heavy is this going to be? And they need to be, that needs to be revised as you go through the project, because like you said, we uncover things as we go along. But what that means, if you're thinking about it at the beginning, it means that when you get an editor on board who is struggling, there is then space to turn around and say, I know this hasn't come up in the risk assessment, but it's one of the questions you ask, and this has happened, and I feel I need that support. So can you make space for it?
And I guess that puts a lot of, I guess, pressure on whoever's struggling to speak up when it's not in the budget ahead of time, or if a project is, even if in a world where we're added to all the budgets, but this team maybe thought that it didn't need to be, and somebody ends up struggling and needs to have that conversation.
It does, but if it's language that we use, if it's language that we begin to use in the industry, and just, because I think it's such a given in therapy that it's a caring profession. It's really difficult. It's, you're dealing with psychological safety, therefore, of course, you need all these things. And I think about the subject matter that we're dealing with in documentary, and the responsibility we have for the people we're filming with, and I wonder why we're not seeing ourselves in the same light. So as soon as it becomes the norm, then it's less
less taboo, I suppose.
Yeah, less stigma attached to it.
Yeah. And I think that I think that we work in a very intimate space, especially on small or low budget projects that are often just maybe the director, one producer, and the editor, sometimes an AE, sometimes not. It's just a very small team, and that sort of intimacy is exciting for collaboration, is all charged by emotional exchanges and shared visions and unified camaraderie to build something bigger than just one person, and to tell this story. But that same intimate relationship can maybe feel a bit burdensome in complicating the maybe the hard-nosed business decisions, like speaking up for ourselves in that way, saying that something is difficult for us, or asking for what we need, even if it's just shorter work days. That I think it's important to also think about, like, the intimacy of the job and where those boundaries lie, like professional relationship with somebody that you might also have come to see as a good friend, that sort of complicates even asking for those things, on top of just it not being currently a conversation in the industry.
Yeah, it does.
And I don't know really what the way around that is. I think it really just you need to choose for yourself to say, like, I need this, and to speak up and know that, like, no one should, I guess, say, judge you or punish in some way you asking for needing something.
It's to turn the idea that asking for help is, which is currently seen as a weakness, is actually to turn that into a strength. Because I think it takes personally, I think it takes a huge amount of strength to be vulnerable, and to ask, and to express that. And actually, when you're doing this work, when you're vulnerable as a director or an editor, that's probably when you're at your most connected with the material, and you can be very creative. Whereas if you switch that vulnerability off because you're too scared of the potential fallout of that, either you're going to be judged for, or you're going to end up coming out of it quite damaged, then your connection also reduces as well. So allowing ourselves to be vulnerable means that we can get a lot closer to the work. I'm not sure we see it like that yet, because we still see that as a weakness. So what we need really is proof that if you get that kind of help, then, because what's happening at the moment is we're experiencing loss in the industry. So that's whether that's people just leaving the industry altogether because they're too because they're
Burnout.
just, yeah, they're burnt out, or they've lost faith in it, or they're dropping off projects because of burnout, or they're being fired because tensions flare up in the relationship because actually what's happening is that people are unable to communicate how they're feeling.
Mm.
And so you tend to lay blame.
Hmm. I think that's interesting, because I've definitely said in the edit room space this idea of trusting the process, this trust, this, so the idea that if we make ourselves vulnerable, that what we present, maybe like it's an editor being very anxious to share their first cut of whatever, and the director and the producer team maybe is very anxious to see what what it is. And so I guess this idea of trusting the process and knowing that we have to be kind to one another in our criticisms and in this vulnerable space,
Yeah.
that's something that we can be doing immediately, to recognize that vulnerability, and be gracious that that's a two-way street. So hopefully, like, we can keep reminding ourselves of that. Trust the process. Everybody tell your directors.
I think so. If you know that you have certain needs, when you're contracting with your producing team, I know this is so much easier to say than it is to do. I do realize that. And so it might sound a bit idealistic, but if you know there's certain things that you need, like a particular way for feedback to be delivered, or things that are triggering for you that are going to send you into a spiral of anxiety, then just be upfront about that in the very beginning, as you're establishing the relationship, because what you're asking them in that moment is to lead to a positive working environment. So it's not actually about them. So it's not, I know this, again, it might sound idealistic. People can't turn around and feel like you're not the right person for them, or that they're being, because you're owning that. You're owning it for yourself. You're like, this is who I am, and this is what I need to work in a really positive way so that you will get the best out of me.
I think that's a really great framework. Just as like, this is laying the foundation. This is the best case that we can make for ourselves in order to make the best possible film we can. And that's something I think also important to acknowledge, that can change. As you had mentioned, it can change throughout the process, and to sort of have that open dialogue to check back in, and say, well, this was working for me, and now let's talk about it in this way, would be more helpful. Or realizing you're over inundated by everything being put into an email or a phone call every other day, or whatever it is.
Absolutely.
That's important to acknowledge, that can change or shift throughout the process too.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that different films, this is an assumption I'm making because I've never edited a film, but I'm assuming that different films have a different pace to them in terms of how you connect with how you need to work with footage.
Yeah, I think just as a producer or director going into the field and having a very different experience on each film, that what is demanded from us, or from the edit, is a wide array of things that it could be, and also just different senses of personalities and collaborations from the producing team or directing team or editors. Just how we like to communicate, all of those sort of things shift from project to project. So I do think that there is a lot of, it's sort of this ever-evolving space that documentary is, that there isn't this formula of like the way, like we go in knowing it's going to be the 22-minute episode of HGTV housing flips or whatever, that it is so unknown in that way, that there is sort of this constant need to be able to pivot or consider a new avenue of looking at something or handling something, which are all things that make doc very exciting, and also increase the need for us to be talking about mental health.
Yeah.
So I think that we are coming up on time for some Q&A. Megan, I'm gonna point towards Megan and see what we have. If you guys have any questions and you haven't already submitted them, go ahead and put in some goodies. Rebecca and maybe myself will weigh in on.
Well, I mean, you
expert.
definitely have the editing experience, so
Yes, I can speak to any editor question specifically. But let's see here. All right, so I don't think we have any currently, so I'm going to keep talking. It means that we are doing an awesome job. I do want to point to people. Megan went ahead and shared in the chat at the beginning of our conversation, and we will share it again at the end, that we've compiled a list of resources that ranging for therapy services for LGBTQ, Black, various organizations that work to funds to help remove the barriers of access to therapy work. And also included in that is a free PDF of the ebook Trauma Stewardship by Laura Van Dernoot-Linsky, I believe is her name. I'm so sorry to her if I butchered that, but that's sort of an everyday guide to caring for yourself while caring for others, which is definitely what we do in the doc space. We're constantly caring for our subjects, our team, and we have to remember to care for ourselves. So
it's interesting, Claire, as you say that, because I've heard that from producers, directors, and editors. And it's like, oh, it's so demanding on top of everybody else to be the person that worries about everybody, or the person that everybody comes to, and there's such a sense of responsibility of holding it all together from all, and everybody's individually feeling that. So you could have a producer, director, and editor in a very intimate working relationship, and you're all individually feeling like you're caring for one another, but not really but not talking about it. And so what one person is experiencing, what are everybody else in that trio experiencing as well, because what's happening in that moment is that you're all acutely aware of how much strain the other person in the relationship is under, and you're trying to make that easier for them.
And so I wonder, how do we do, one of the questions that just came in is sort of up that alley, that they've been noticing a lot of tension in working relationships that really sparked from the quarantines that we're in, and that it's not something that we openly acknowledge, but how do you manage the ups and downs of other people on your team's trauma? How do you take space for yourself when the rest of the team may be overextending themselves and you need to step back?
Because so you're asking, you need to ask for space for yourself, but you're aware that everybody else is going through some really big stuff as well.
Sure. Or that the project needs to be moving forward for the net, that maybe the deadlines are hard, haven't changed despite everything going on.
Yeah, I mean, with the deadlines, I guess some deadlines are unavoidable, but some we set them. They get set by people, and we never really question whether that needs to be the deadline or not. I realize when you're delivering to a broadcaster that it often does, but in this situation, I don't know how strict they need to be. I think if you're really struggling yourself, one of the things that I feel would be really useful at a time like this is regular check-ins with your team. So I think it's just an acknowledgement that everybody has been affected by this, and everybody's been affected by this, but everybody's been affected in different ways. Some of us have lost work, some of us are still working, some of us have kids at home, some of us don't, some of us are living alone and we're feeling isolated, and other people don't. It's just so different, in terms of how it's affected income and social lives and everything, that I think finding out what's going on in people's personal lives, if you're interested or it feels important to the work, is just first and foremost, it's like, how are you, and sitting down and creating that space where you can then say, I'm wondering what the scope is to be able to take some time out, because this has been my experience and it's really hard. And if I had a couple of days off, I'll come back with more fire and more energy to be able to push it through for that deadline.
I
Um,
imagine that works, that, that works as a two-way street. If you yourself aren't feeling overextended, or like having that you're not struggling, but opening up the space in your team
mm,
could give the space for somebody else to say, I to have that check-in and say, I need that time also.
yeah.
Um,
And
instead of
if you're able to do it before you hit the point of exhaustion,
Mm.
then it doesn't, then it comes across in a much, it's like it's preventative, isn't it, rather than um, yeah, you're preventing collapse rather than reacting to collapse in that situation.
And would that be maybe the framework as far as um, taking mental health days as sick days? That there are sometimes there's 6 days written into your contract or working with a certain company, um, but that in approaching your employer or maybe producers or your team, to maybe, would that be the best way to frame, like, mental health days are preventative in some ways, um, for down the
Yeah,
road?
yeah, I would think so, because if you've hit the point of collapse, then it's much harder to recover from that. You know, you're at the bottom of a mountain. You've gone all the way to the bottom, and you have to start at the bottom to climb back up to where you were before you can even get past that.
Mm.
Whereas if you recognize where you are, imagine you're a climber, and you know you're hanging on an overhang, and it's like, oh, this is really hard. If you keep trying, you're going to drop off. You're going to drop off,
Hmm.
and and fall back a few paces. Whereas if you just stop and rest your arms, just stop and rest until your muscles start working again. I don't know how many of you've climbed, but that's kind of what it's like. And then you find the energy to get over the edge.
Yeah.
But you haven't lost all that space, all that work that you did,
Yeah.
like that.
I love that analogy. I'm just now like thinking about being in a rock climbing gym, and those or it's awful. It's the worst strain, So to feel
Yeah.
that physically, I think is like a great metaphor to put it in.
And I haven't climbed for years. I don't know where that came from. It just popped into my
Deep
head.
is the memory recall.
Yeah, yeah.
So nice job. So we have another question here about the issue of overworking, that our teammates sort of to hit the hilt because the story is important, and the sacrifices that we make for that. This question says, I've seen in myself and in my colleagues, especially minorities, that we get exploited, and we will allow it because of a false sense of love for film,
Mm.
and that we end up overworking with no space for privacy. Could you speak to that? The idea that of overworking and maybe feeling exploited, but choosing to power on for the project, the sake of the project.
Mm. I think that's what I was alluding to before when I was saying
Mm.
it's considered really noble work. So it's really difficult to turn around and go, no, it can't actually take everything from me, because I am also important, you know, in in this process. And we don't do that. We give the film itself, the project itself. We never really consider how much power that has
Mm.
over us as an entity, as a a being, in a sense. And its needs are always greater than everybody else's.
Mm.
um, and I think is uh, that is a psychological shift that we need to work towards in the industry,
And
because
well, go ahead.
I don't know what we can say.
Well, so we have another question that is asking what sort of discussions, if you've had any with funders or other producers about putting therapy in as a line item in budgets. It seems like a tall order. So, in order to create that as the norm, what does that look like? And has
Yeah,
that?
yeah, I have spoken to funders about it, and they are open to that for sure. I mean, I know POV are trying to launch this hardship fund, I think. So that, I mean, part of that is to cover mental health support, and so it is happening. I don't know what we would call it. I suppose you would just put a line in for therapeutic consultation, or whatever the phrase is that you feel you need. It might not be therapy. It might be it. Yeah, it might be like, um, creative retreats for your director and producer, or you don't, you need to find out what it is that you need to put into your that your team needs to feel that they have that rest time, or that sort of something additional to help them process everything. But I imagine therapy is the most obvious example. And so there's two things there. Just start putting it in the budget, and your funder can turn around and say no if they want to, but it would be hard to.
Right. It would be them saying like, we don't care in some
Yeah,
ways.
yeah. You're like, really? Okay, that doesn't sound great. So no, I would just start putting it in the budget, and as so many things in the budget, we don't raise the money for it. But at least if it's there, there's a recognition that this project is challenging, and this is what I feel I need to get it made. And then yes, on the flip side, I have spoken to funders, to quite a few actually, and yeah, they're very amenable to the idea. And actually, when you open up the conversation with them, they also turn around and talk about how hard it is for them as well, in terms of the decisions they have to make and the people that they have to let down or not let down. I've ended up having like a sort of like roundtable discussion with funders as well about what support they need in the industry, because we are struggling in so many ways, and that partly because we don't communicate very well for 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 an industry that's incredibly empathic and full of really emotionally intelligent people. It's quite funny. Well, it's not funny, but it's a surprise.
I think we think of the funders as these elusive groups that we're always chasing and that we need, and that we just want them to see us. And it's very self-focused when we think of funders, for ourselves or the project. So I think that's great to also look at and consider that it happens at all tiers of the spectrum.
Yeah,
Um, we
different
need
problems.
like some group wide, industry wide for all tiers, budget for in the companies even,
Yeah,
is what it sounds like. Is
yeah.
there, another question is, do you know of any companies that provides film specific mental health counseling for, like, what about a team, like team counseling? So everybody maybe is dealing with the same subject matter and processing it, and sort of having a moderated space to talk through some of that. Has that ever been talked about, rather than just an individual crew member going off into their own spaces?
Not not that I'm aware of
Yes.
in documentary, and I would love anyone to get in touch if they are doing that, because I think that's an amazing thing. I mean, I'm definitely hearing of more people who are getting into this field, but it's something I do. Is I would come on. Obviously, it's all online work. That's the frustrating thing because of where I live, but it works. Come on at the beginning of a process and consult, to looking through the subject matter, looking through any existing material, looking at your team. So it's because it's not just the subject matter that we need to look at. If you want to be inclusive and you want to hire as interesting and inclusive a team as possible, you need to accept that your team will come with all of their own stuff as well. So you might be hiring somebody with a mental health illness that needs support during that process, or you might be hiring somebody who's working on that project because they have experience with that issue. And if that's the case, then they could be triggered, or and it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be doing it. It doesn't mean they're not strong enough to do it. It just means that they need to be supported while they're doing it.
And are there any, you had alluded to the needs for sort of, I guess, proof in this space. Do you know, are there any medical studies that point to this? Like, so that when we're advocating for mental health assessments and budgets on project, like, is there any sort of aggregated data trying to be collected that you know of for any of this? Or is it, we're sort of really at the precipice or the
Yeah,
beginning?
we're definitely at the precipice. Not in the US, no. And I've been talking a lot with the D word about that and about what to do about that. And I know there's lots of discussions happening with lots of different organisations in the States. In the UK, we had a big the Film and TV charity did a big survey last year, and the findings were released in January, and it was across the board. It was the whole of the screen, industries. So it wasn't just documentary, it was fiction, it was gaming, it was everything, and it included all roles, so directors, producers, editors, cinematographers, everybody.
Is
And
that in a survey format, like some sort of predetermined questions that were
yeah, all on
revealing
mental
details
health.
that people.
Yeah, and the statistics were devastating. They
And
were
was
out
that, how did they release the findings from that? Was that a
Yeah,
um,
there's a report on their website. So it's the Film and TV Charity, and obviously it's UK specific, but we know these things are transferable across the ocean. I mean, it's the nature of the industry, and just it was really sad to see. I mean, I wasn't surprised because I've been having these conversations for some time now, but to see it, to have that backed up, to have that validated was something else. So
yeah.
I think there should be something similar. There should be something similar done in every country, really. But I would like to see something done internationally for documentary specifically, because it's so unique. I think I think it has the same problems as a lot of the other areas of film have, but then there's this added element of the subject matter and the fact that it's live situations, it's people's lives that we're filming with, and that just lends it a uniqueness that doesn't exist anywhere else in the industry.
Yeah. And so I wonder, who helms that, like if it is international, is it needing sort of a representative group that collects data within your own country, and then it's
Yeah.
sent out to be aggregated with everybody else, that I don't know those answers, but it
Yeah.
seems like a large undertaking for sure.
Yeah, it is, and I'm putting feelers out, and I would love to be part of that process for sure, because I think it's really important. Um, and then how do you manage it in terms of what specific different problems are in each country, because every system is slightly different.
Yeah.
So it's a complex piece of work, but it feels
Yeah.
important.
We'll have to we're going to keep our heads to the ground on that one, and keep our ears out, and work towards that, hopefully by having more conversations like this and
Yeah,
continuing to express the need for mental health awareness in the industry, that something like that can become a reality. We have one last question that I want to address. Somebody is wondering, how do you make space for mental health when you're early on in your career? I think that there is an expectation that you sort of pay your dues, you work the long hours, that you're sort of hustling for maybe the credit or that entry level foot in the door
yeah,
in an industry that's already exploitive for people who've been in it for decades. And it feels like maybe expressing the need for that space could lose you work.
yeah, absolutely. And I think in some cases that's probably true. It could lose you work. Um, I'm somebody that's moved into this area because of growing up, as it were, in an industry that didn't value self care. I burnt out a couple of times. I ended up with sort of viral infections that are caused from that are a result of exhaustion. You know, and it took me two of those to learn from my mistakes. So yeah, I guess it's a risk. It's taking that risk, but like I said before, it's about framing it in a way that's not accusatory to the people you're working with or the industry that you work in, but it's about being as positive in that conversation as you possibly can be. These are the things that I need to keep me safe. These are the things that I need to work as productively as possible. Is that possible? You don't have to put it in as a I will not work any other way, and
Sure.
sometimes it's unavoidable that we're going to work incredibly long hours, like the project. There just isn't a way around it. And then what you need afterward, well, then I feel like the edit process should be shorter, so that what you can and you get the same amount of money, so what you can take afterwards is 2 weeks off before moving on to the next project. So recognizing that you've just had a really, really difficult time, and you need to recover from that. And it's not a holiday. That's part of your working time. It should be part of your working time.
To have a decompressed space in between projects and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that
That's
sounds
when your vicarious trauma comes up, when you stop.
after stepping away from it.
Yeah.
Wow. I think that is really important to try to take that space too. So I think that we are up on the time. So I want to thank everybody for all of their insightful questions. Special thank you to Rebecca for her time and insight. I do want to leave us with a few thoughts. Things that I hope we can all recognize from today is that none of us are alone, that all of these feelings are normal, and anybody carrying on, as normal amidst all of this is in denial. You are grounded in reality, even though you don't feel like it. You are not failing. Reject all the ideas on what you should be doing or what you need, and take the time to reflect and ask for the things that you need, especially in this current time and space. Figuring out what each of us needs is it's going to be different from me to Rebecca to you, and all of those ways are valid. So just reflect on that yourself. Find a support team. Maybe that's ADE. Maybe that's reaching out to counselors or friends that you've had that supported you in the past, and that whatever happens, you've got this. We've got this. We've all surely survived trying times in the past, and you can do this too. Just don't hesitate to reach out for help, and there's a lot of power in this community. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Rebecca, I don't know if you had any final words before you had a lot of thank yous.
I felt really invigorated by that, and I was like, well, we're having a series of little revolutions at the moment, so let's all be part of the change. Especially people coming into the industry, it's just like, set your stall out right at the beginning, and then hopefully that's the way you get to work in your career. And I hope that this becomes the norm, really.
I hope that I believe that we recorded this conversation, and we should send it out to the film industry, to our editor friends who might need to hear this, anybody who needs to know that this is important to be talking about.
And if anyone is working with a therapist that has experience in the film industry, and that you feel really connects with what we've been talking about, then let me know, because part of what I want to do through Film in Mind is kind of create a resort, a resource place for people to come to, so that I'm not the only person that people have to speak to, because choice is really important. So.
Totally. Then sometimes it's hard to find the right fit, and like in general. And so the more options, the better. I hope that there are more and more people doing the work that you're doing with Film in Mind. I will remind everyone that there's a resource document being shared in the chat that has been sent out to everyone. In that is also Rebecca's contact information and the Film in Mind website. So you are able to reach her if you do know of anybody, or if you need and are able to nab her services. Clearly from this conversation, she's wonderful. So a final thank you. We hope this has been helpful for everyone, and that this is a conversation that we keep having.
Yes, definitely.
And one final bit is, if you need to join ADE, there's also a link to do that in the chat. All right, and on that note, thank you so much, Rebecca. Thanks everybody for listening. Adios, au revoir. Take care of yourself. Everybody have a really great day.